You're listening to Nature as Beloved, Nature as Self, a podcast about wilderness Christian mysticism. I'm your host, Stephen Hatch, a contemplative living in New Mexico and former faculty at Naropa University. For over 45 years, I've been leading a simple lifestyle, combining family life with meditation, silence, and solitary time in the great outdoors. Along the way, I've developed an outlook rooted in Christian spirituality, informed by the world's great mystical traditions, and inspired by the wisdom found in nature. I'll be joined by my co-host, Will Warwick, also a contemplative, nature lover, and religious studies scholar. This podcast is for kindred mystics, lovers of nature, and people who consider themselves spiritual but not religious. It's for those who are genuine seekers of truth, goodness, and beauty. And it's for those who want to live a more authentic life. Please join us as we explore the vast landscape of this contemplative tradition.
Welcome back, friends and listeners, and a happy new year to you. Hey, Stephen, how you doing today?
I am good, Will. Yeah, bright sunny day here in New Mexico.
Well, it's nice and wet and dark here in the Pacific Northwest. So we're picking up where we left off on our last episode, where we began talking about the deeper meaning of Christ. We don't see Christ as a symbol of division, dogma, or exclusion, but rather we see Christ as an all-encompassing, all-embracing, unifying presence within all things. So today we're going to dive deeper into that, and to better understand who Christ is in our lives, we're going to be looking at a handful of metaphors. Christ as a mirror of our true selves, Christ as light and warmth, and as alpenglow, Christ as a listening presence, and Christ as the light of interbeing. So for those who are listening, this conversation might be of interest to you, especially if you are a Christian seeking renewal, you're spiritual but not religious and are simply exploring new horizons, or you simply might be someone who's intrigued by the connection of faith in our shared human experience. And having said that, we're going to just get into it today. Look at these 5 fresh metaphors for better understanding and connecting with Christ.
Yes.
And we're starting with the metaphor of Christ as a mirror of the true self.
Well, it's interesting. For contemplatives in the Middle Ages, there were 2 verses in the New Testament that they repeated over and over again that speak of Christ as being a mirror of the true self. The first one is in the first letter of John in the chapter 3, where it says, "Dear friends, now we are the children of God, and what we will be has not yet been made known. But we know that when Christ appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is." So there's this sense here that as you really see Christ, then you are that. So he is this kind of mirror. Of course, where do we see Christ? We see Christ in icons. We see Christ in experiences in community. We see the inner Christ, as the Quakers have the inner light, and various other places in the natural world, as we'll talk about. So the more we see the presence of Christ, the more we are that, because he serves as a mirror. And this is made even more explicit in the second letter to the Corinthians in chapter 3, where, reading from the Greek New Testament, it says, "And we who with unveiled faces contemplate as in a mirror the Lord's glory," and glory means radiance, "are being transformed into that image with ever increasing glory or radiance, which comes from God, who is the Spirit." So there it's made explicit in the Greek word that we're gazing at the presence of Christ as in a mirror, and in so doing, we see our own true self. We do this, of course, all throughout our lives. We see things, we experience things that are like a mirror of who we are. Indeed, it's one of the reasons people like sports teams, right? The sports team wins. That's a mirror that, oh, I must be a winner. Various groups that we're part of, oh, our spiritual community is growing. It's big. Oh, then that we think that means, oh, that we must be important. But in the sense of Christ as mirror, there's a certain humility to that, as we'll see. And the same thing, of course, occurs in other traditions. The Gautama Buddha is a mirror of the true self of a Buddhist, and so forth. So the medieval monks in the Middle Ages, we've talked about how that whole idea of substitutionary atonement, that people think that that is Christianity and nothing could be further than the truth, based on sin and guilt, and Christ has to take this punishment that we deserve. That didn't start till the 11th century. What before that, and then all through the Middle Ages, there was a more aesthetic slant to the process of being made whole, or what's called salvation. So, for example, John of Ford, a 12th century Cistercian monk, he says this is why Christ was born and why he came into the world, that the appearance of his classic beauty and the classic beauty of his appearance might wipe away the disfigurement from the whole human race. So, as you gaze upon the beauty of Christ, in whatever context that happens, then you're able to absorb that beauty into your own being. So, personal transformation comes from this gazing on the beauty or loveliness of Christ. As John of Ford says, the face of Christ powerfully transforms every face into the likeness of its own brilliance. The soul, looking longingly into the face of Christ, becomes radiant from the light of his truth and glows with the fire of love. It wholly concentrates the gaze of its heart on him and exerts all its power to hold it there until this true and original image gives rise to a living image of itself in us in its own way. So we must set our hearts on that image to be formed anew in perceiving Christ. And then the image of Christ's face shines forth from ours. So there's this interconnection between these two. When you truly gaze at something, that part of yourself comes to light and, in a sense, is born in you. So it's a very organic kind of way of seeing the presence of Christ.
I think that's very beautiful. And it highlights a yogic principle that I've come to know over the years, which is what we give our attention to grows inside of us.
Yes.
Here we're saying, where we give our gaze to is going to basically change us and transform us. Or in other words, we're speaking about Christ as a person. Who we spend our time with, we're going to become more like that
Oh,
person.
right. Yes, yes.
And in here, by gazing upon Christ, somehow in a mystical sense, we become more like Christ in those qualities.
Absolutely. And it's because of that mirroring. Now, there's two stories that I like to tell that also illustrate this. The first comes from the Iroquois tradition, upstate New York, the five nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. And it's a story about a cannibal, the man who kills and eats people, and a figure, a Christ like figure named the Peacemaker. So the story goes like this: the man who kills and eats people was stirring the pot of the remains of his latest kill, an enemy. And his theory was that if he killed someone and he cooked them up and ate them, he would absorb their powers. Well, he's in his wigwam and he is cooking up a stew of his latest enemy. And he looks into the grease at the top of the pot. And in that pot, as he looks into it, he sees a very peaceful, harmonious, loving face. And he looks at that and he says, is that who I am? If I'm this peaceful person, this loving person, what am I doing killing my enemies and eating them? And so he takes the pot outside, he dumps it out, and lo and behold, a figure comes down from the top of the wigwam. The peacemaker was up top, gazing through the hole at the top of the wigwam, and it was the peacemaker's face who was shining onto the pot. But the man who kills and eats people thought it was his face, and indeed it was, because the peacemaker was forming a mirror in which he could see his true self. So the peacemaker comes down from the top of the wigwam. He greets the man who kills and eats people, and they embrace. And then the story says that the peacemaker gives the man who kills and eats people a new name. It doesn't say what that name is, but I love this story because it is this very humble peacemaker who doesn't say, "Hey, I'm up top here, look at me," but he is able to gaze through the smoke hole in the wigwam so that the man who kills and eats people is able to see himself in a new light. The other story comes from the Christian tradition of Clare of Assisi, who was the co worker with Francis of Assisi. And as you know, at that time in the 13th century, there were a bunch of civil wars occurring in Italy. And she was in the church with her sisters, which had become a convent. And the soldiers were knocking at the door. They wanted to come in, and they were going through the land of killing anyone that they found. So Claire, much to the dismay of the sisters in the church, found a mirror that was used in some of their ceremonies. She undoes the deadbolt on the door, opens it up, and she just stands there with this mirror facing the soldiers. Now, as the story goes, and of course there's a whole mythology around Frances and Claire, the powers of her holiness, her gentleness and love are transferred to that mirror. So when the soldiers look in the mirror, they see these very gentle and loving people who would never go into a village and go just indiscriminately kill others. And so they look in the mirror and say, "Is that who we are?" And as they look in the mirror, they also see all of their relatives and loved ones. And so they leave the church realizing that they are actually loving and peaceful people and don't go and carry out the acts of murder and such that they were about to do. So it's a very powerful story about Claire serving as a mirror in which those soldiers could see who they really are. And of course, each of us is called to do the same thing, to mirror the best qualities of each other. So it's very important how we treat others because we all serve as mirrors for one another. So it's interesting, in the context of wilderness mysticism, nature forms a mirror in which we see our true self. There's so many times, I mean, you know how society is these days. It's quite stressful, it's complex. There's always things, stressful occurrences across the world, eating at the corners of our awareness, taking our attention away from really what we really want to do. So we go out into the mirror of nature to find who we really are. So, for example, we might go out to the wide sky. In Tibetan Buddhism, there's actually a practice called sky gazing, in which the more you gaze at the sky, the more your awareness becomes expansive, and you identify with the space of consciousness rather than the objects that appear in that consciousness. So the sky mirrors our expansiveness and dignity. Henry David Thoreau said that we go to lakes to see our own tranquility reflected there. So water forms a mirror of our own inner tranquility. We might go to a wildflower meadow of all different species, like we have here in the mountains of New Mexico or Colorado, just north of here, and find a whole wide array of different flowers, say red paintbrush and blue columbines and yellow senecio. And as we gaze at this meadow and spend time in it, the beauty transfers to us. And so we feel the inner loveliness. John Muir had a direct experience of this when he was up in Canada, and then later in the Sierra Nevada, where he found a rare white lily. And he said that the purity of the lily transferred itself to his own sense of identity and enhancing his self esteem. So he could write, "I found a lovely lily, pure as snow crystal, one of the plant saints that all must love, and be made as much purer by it every time it is seen." And for Muir, of course, plants were the most sacred of all creatures. He really loved plants, including large trees. So the beauty of this lily transferred itself to mirror. He was lonely at the time, and he found that in this lily, he himself found an inner purity, which helped him to go on. So, in the context of Christian wilderness mysticism, we realize that the presence of Christ inhabits all of these different mirrors. So when any mirror, whether it's Christian, like the one of Clare of Assisi, or the Iroquois peacemaker, or a mountain, or a wildflower meadow, or a sky, or animal, it communicates to us a calm, radiant, personal warmth and love. We can be sure that we are experiencing the presence of Christ permeating all things. And within all of these mirrorings, it's this calm, radiant, personal warmth and love that is the hallmark of the presence of Christ rather than any kind of doctrine or teaching. So, when any of these elements, especially the non human ones, may in their natural state seem to care little about our individual state of being, storms can come from the sky, earthquakes can come from the ground, but nevertheless we experience this love, we realize that the presence of Christ is there within it. So, here the term panentheism, God or Christ within all things, comes to bear, so that nature, maybe as it forms a mirror of our inner goodness, but it also couldn't destroy us with hurricanes, tornadoes, and earthquakes, mediates the love of Christ to us because of this indwelling Christ. So, in other words, it isn't the exact same thing as Christ because Christ isn't here to destroy us, but has the presence of God and Christ within it. And so, as Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas, it's I who am the all. From me did the all come forth, and unto me did the all extend. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there. So I often encounter people who say, what do you mean nature is red in tooth and claw? And then you get the Darwinian sense of evolution of the competition between all things, which of course is only one aspect of nature. Cooperation is the other. But people will say, well, what do you mean that nature is a mirror of my true self in a loving sense? Especially people maybe who grew up on a farm and they're used to wolves coming, coyotes coming and killing their sheep or whatever. They think that we're over romanticizing nature. Well, in the Christian sense, the panentheism allows us to account for the nature red and in tooth and claw and the love that's also present there, realizing that the love indwells it. And whenever that is a calm, radiant kind of golden glow that we feel in our heart, we can be sure that that is the presence of Christ. So we can also say that this mirroring occurs with all different other spiritual presences as well. Christ isn't the only one, of course, but he's one particular way of experiencing the mirroring. So, for example, in the Buddhist tradition, there is a sort of maybe cool and sometimes detached mirror in which we find that calmness within us. So, in the Lakota tradition, say there's a Unchimaka or grandmother earth. There's a sort of wide presence that is in the earth that has a feminine tone to it that is mirroring us back. Or perhaps in someone like Rumi, there is a passionate kind of mirroring, as Sufi spirituality is a kind of passionate love, while Christian spirituality is sort of calm and radiant love. So there are many different ways of being mirrored, and Christ is one of those ways of mirroring that kind of calm, radiant glow.
One of the things I'm curious about is how is it that these qualities of calm, radiant, personal warmth and love, as well as golden light, have come to be ascribed to Christ?
Well, I think it's an experiential kind of thing that happens. Especially, I find the study of the various world religions very helpful because you realize that each one has a quality of its own. I sometimes like to describe it as different colors. So perhaps each mirroring has a different color. When I
Mm.
am in a Buddhist frame of mind, there's sort of a cool, detached kind of feel, even though someone like the Dalai Lama has a warmth to him. He's very unique in his own way. Many Rinpoches that I've talked to or Zen masters have a sort of a calm, a cool, collected kind of radiance to them. If I were to ascribe a color, it would be blue. When I study Native American spirituality and get into that mindset around here at the Taos Pueblo, or where I used to live in Colorado with the Lakota, there is a kind of expansive, grounded, earthy sort of mirroring that occurs when you're outside in the earth. If I were to ascribe a color to it, it would be green. When I am immersed in Sufi spirituality of Rumi and Ibn al Arabi and others, there is a passionate kind of love and longing. If I were to ascribe a color to that, it would be red. And then when I come back to the Christian tradition, there's also a love like there is in the Sufi tradition, but it's kind of calm, all permeating, radiant love that is very gentle. And if I were to ascribe a color to that mirroring, it's golden. So I find that it's in the study of the various world religions that I have come to experience what is unique about Christ as well as what is unique in each of the other traditions.
My next question for you is, how does Christ's death and ascension into all things enable us to become mirrors ourselves?
Well, people, they were taught by their religious institutions that Christ's death was a punitive kind of thing in order to make up for our foibles or sins. But in actuality, in the Gospels, Christ's death is the way that he is able to extend throughout all things. So during his lifetime, people that knew him might have been tempted to think that the presence that was in Jesus, so remember the distinction between Christ or the Logos and Jesus, was only in him as an individual. But he tells us then that he has to go away so that the Spirit, his Spirit, can come and dwell within us. So that involves him dying to one personal form and then rising within each of us so that the presence of Christ, that calm, radiant love, that is then sort of infused with the personality of Jesus, is within all of us, and not just Christians, but all human beings and indeed all of creation. So it is his dying that enables him to resurrect into each of us. Whether or not you want to talk about an empty tomb and it's a bodily resurrection, there for sure, experientially, is this sense that Christ is risen within each of us. So, another way to look at it is he dies to the individual billiard ball ego self that each of us have. We all need to have that self because it protects us from the dangerous influences throughout the world and other people that just want to walk all over us. But we cling onto it a little too tightly, and it becomes like a billiard ball with solid edges to it. But Christ enables those edges to become permeable, and so we expand and dissolve into something larger, which we call the Christ in the Christian tradition. Some people will call it Christ consciousness. So Christ's death to the billiard ball self, which some, like Thomas Keating, have called the false self because it thinks it's the ultimate thing, this sort of solid, boundaried self, dies and then resurrects as the cosmic or universal self. And when Christ does this, because remember, he is like a grain of yeast or leaven that allows the whole loaf of humanity, the bread of that loaf, to rise. So as he does it, then each of us is able to do it. So Paul says, I have been co crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. So Christ's presence, this humble, self giving life, is then within him, so that Paul can say, I want to fill up in my flesh what's still lacking of the afflictions of Christ. It feels like an affliction to give up the ego self because we hang on to it so tightly. So it's not suffering for some sort of punishment or for sin, but it's the natural process through which the billiard ball ego self lets go and dissolves into something bigger. So Christ in Paul can exclaim, you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. And who is Christ? Just another billiard ball self? No. Christ is this kind of universal presence, this calm, radiant warmth that is among all things. So Christ dies on one level in order to become a mirror on another level. Remember, he is able to mirror back to us who we really are so that he's no longer just himself, but he's a mirror for all of us. And this, in turn, because of the way that grain of yeast is able to permeate the entire loaf, enables us to do the same. I'm not saying this is only true of Jesus and of Christ. It's true of all the different religious figures that have inhabited the planet. For example, the Buddha's presence on this earth, he is a different type, say, of yeast that is able to allow the whole loaf of humanity to rise, so that each of us is able to have perhaps that sort of spacious, calm, detached kind of self. So, in each of the traditions, there is a different kind of mirroring. It's just that in the Christian tradition, it's this sort of calm, radiant warmth of calm love that is able to inhabit all of humanity and enables us to become mirrors then, just as Christ was a mirror for us.
So you also have spoken about this before in your writings that the Christian Eucharist reflects this mirroring process.
Yes, it's a very tangible way of experiencing Christ. Having grown up in a Protestant tradition, we only had the the Lord's Supper or communion, the bread and the wine, as a sort of a remembrance, as sort of a watered down version of what the earlier church had and is still present in the Catholic tradition, in the Eastern Orthodox, and in some others like the Lutheran, which is that Christ is actually present in the bread and the wine. So it's not just a symbol, but there's an actual presence there. And I find that even though I'm not Catholic, whenever I go to a Catholic church and I participate in the Eucharist, I find that it is a very powerful experience of Christ. So Teilhard de Chardin, who was a famous French priest, anthropologist, and mystic, he understood that when we consecrate the bread and the wine as the body and blood of Christ, that is, the very presence of Christ, we enable all of the material world, all of matter, all the creatures of the world to manifest itself as divine and as a manifestation of the same presence of Christ. So, from a wilderness mysticism perspective, the Eucharistic ceremony is a mirror that enables us to see all of matter as divine and chock full of this calm, radiant warmth of Christ. It is a mirror revealing the divinity of all of matter. Of course, we might have other ways that we find the divinity of matter. Indigenous Native American ceremonies might show us the sacredness of matter in other ways, but the Christian way is to show this calm and radiant kind of warmth. This sort of mirror that's in the Eucharist then allows us to find it everywhere else. And I find it viscerally and tangibly as I take the cup, the wine, as it goes down my throat. I feel that kind of warmth. So it is a actual tangible, visceral experience of the presence of Christ as this radiant warmth that is going into me and remaking me into its presence. So the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, the communion is a very tangible, visible kind of way of experiencing the presence of Christ as a mirror that then enables us to go out into the world and, like Teilhard de Chardin, find all of matter as sacred and as chock full of Christ.
That's very powerful. And it also leads us into our next metaphor, Christ as light and warmth. And we've already touched upon those qualities thus far. We're going to shift the gaze in that direction right now.
Yeah,
And when we speak of Christ as light and warmth, we also could say, Christ is a light shining on the divinity of the world. And also, Christ is a fire burning
yeah,
deep within the soul.
yes. Well, it's interesting, the metaphor of light. Christians learned a lot from the Neoplatonists of the early part of the Common Era, and Plotinus was one of those who spoke of the One or God as a radiant sun that shines out, and that all the different layers of the cosmos are the different rays of the sun. So it's a very powerful kind of metaphor that speaks of this light. connected to the sun. Now, we hear often that Christ is a light of the world, right? But some theologians have explored this in ways I think that our modern world often doesn't think about. For example, the Lutheran theologian Rudolf Bultmann, he says Jesus as light is sent as the revealer. But what does he reveal? He reveals that he is sent as revealer. This means that Jesus puts life itself into a fresh light. But what then has been revealed? Nothing at all insofar as the question involves doctrines. On the other hand, everything has been revealed insofar as our eyes are open concerning our own existence and we're once again able to understand ourselves. The point, he says, is not what is revealed, but that the hearer is challenged by the word, the divine word, to understand herself, himself in a new way, no longer dependent upon society for security, but dependent on the indwelling divine presence. So, in other words, Christ is not a light that shines on itself. It seems that you get this from a lot of fundamentalist Christianity that Christ is trying to constantly shine the light on himself, so that saying, "Look at me, look, I'm not like you. I'm much greater." And Bultmann's pointing out that this light is selfless. For example, if you're camping and you have a headlamp, the headlamp is revealing everything around you. But what is it like when you're camping with someone and they shine their headlight on you and you're looking right at the headlight? You can't see anything. So you say, turn that thing down. So that's why there's sometimes a red mode on the headlamp, so that it doesn't shine in such a way that you look right at the person and see that light. Well, Christ, of course, is able to shine on all things in such a way that all things light up, but there isn't the light shining on itself. In other words, he's not a headlamp you could ever look at directly, but he is enabling the whole world to light up in a whole kind of glow that is absolutely beautiful. So we see the light of the world in a new way that before was hidden because of this very humble kind of light. So this is why I like to use the image of alpenglow. So here in New Mexico and in Colorado and anywhere you have mountains, you have what's called alpenglow. Indeed, the mountains right where I am looking at are called the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the Blood of Christ Mountains. They glow a ruddy red or pink or lavender. And I love this image of alpenglow. It really illustrates this humble light of Christ that doesn't shine on itself, but in this case is shining on the mountains. So when the alpenglow shines on the mountains, you're usually in a position that is lower, below the mountains, so you can't see the sun that is shining the last rays onto that kind of sun of the mountains. And so they light up, but you can't see the light itself. And indeed, as a metaphor, you might say that Christ is this light on the horizon. But if you were to travel endlessly across the horizon because of Christ's kenosis or self emptying humility, you could never come to the light itself because the light is emptied out in humility into lighting up those mountains. And so it is, as we extend the metaphor, all of the world, all of the cosmos lights up in this radiant kind of glow, and you can't find that light anywhere as it is in itself. John Muir had said, alpenglow is the most impressive of all the terrestrial manifestations of God. All things are divinized in the light of alpenglow. They disappear into spiritual beauty. They seem neither high nor low, but they melt into universal beauty as a part of their maker. So, this light that Bultmann's talking about, that doesn't care to give us doctrines, but reveals the light of the world in a whole new way, I think the alpenglow metaphor is really helpful in this. Another thing that I like to talk about, fundamentalists often say, well, you're not giving enough credit to Christ. You're not wanting to shine any light of attention on him. You're just wanting to shine it on the world. And I thought about this one time, and the paradoxes of wilderness Christian mysticism. I like to go to the canyon country of southern Utah. And here's what I noticed. I'm a photographer, of course, so I'm always looking for the qualities of light. So when the sun shines on one of the canyon walls, it's kind of boring photographically because it's washed out. But here's the thing, the light reflects off of that wall onto the other wall, the opposite wall, as this is especially true, say, when you're in a slot canyon that's very narrow. And oh my golly, that opposite wall takes on this ruddy, radiant, reddish glow that is absolutely beautiful. So, in the metaphor, even if you were to shine the light of attention on Christ because of his humility, he would immediately bounce it back to the other wall, that is, to the world, so that it would shine in even more beauty than the wall that it's shining on. So, Christ is always bouncing it back to us. Another image that I like to use when we talk about this light is that of the magnifying glass. And so Thomas Merton talks about how that Christ is a magnifying glass, and he says it this way: it concentrates the rays of the sun into a little burning knot of heat that can set fire to a dry leaf or piece of paper. So the mystery of Christ concentrates the rays of God's light and fire to a point that sets fire to the spirit of humanity. Through the glass of Christ's incarnation being embodied, he concentrates the rays of the divine truth and love upon us so that we feel the burn. I remember as a kid, I was so fascinated how I could take a magnifying glass outside and just train it on a leaf, and the sunlight coming through it would set the leaf on fire in all of its glory. So this image is beautiful. Again, the humility of it, just like the alpenglow image, is amazing because here it shows this sort of penetrative energy of Christ's light that is non-intrusive and utterly selfless. Because of the window-like clarity, a magnifying glass could appear to be a mere extension of the sky, like a mere nothing. It's devoid of any kind of self-glorifying ego, and yet it is able to focus the sky's light in such a way that the leaf comes ablaze. So, likewise, the presence of Christ appears transparent to the divine space of which he is a part. It seems like a clear nothing, and yet all of us come ablaze when the light shines on us. So, the sunlight of Logos wisdom penetrates invisibly into our depths and allows us to flame in the colors of our own unique fire. Like that magnifying glass, the Christ Logos does the work silently, without movement, and without appearing to be anything other than a clear window. So again, you get this amazing sense of the humility of Christ that does not call attention to itself. In this case, the magnifying glass is able for us to blaze into the full glory of our passion.
There's a lot there. And what I want to come back to is the objection you pointed out with fundamentalists, saying that as wilderness Christian mystics, we fail to adequately make Christ into an object
Mhm.
of adoration. And there's perhaps some irony in there because, like we said, gazing upon Christ or spending time with Christ, we become more like Christ, who is constantly beholding us and emptying his love to us, the kenosis. So, in that sense, you know, and you've spoken about this before, we take on that mind of Christ and we begin to see as Christ would see that, yes, our attention therefore would shift from Christ to then looking upon all of the earth, all creatures, all people with that same type of gaze
Yes.
of simply beholding and adoring all of creation.
Yeah, and this goes back to that story in the Gospels where some people say we want to see Jesus, and the word gets through his disciples back to him. What is the answer to we want to see Jesus? The answer is the seed must fall into the ground and die so that it can produce many other seeds. So he's shifting it right back to us who are the plant, a part of his presence, his body, that are billions of different seeds. So even though they want to focus on Jesus, he puts it right back to us. which I love. I love that kind of humility. Again, like the canyon wall. Okay, focus your attention on Christ. That's one canyon wall. And he'll shift it right back to you. He says, we'll do greater things than he. He could have also said, you will be even more lovely than me, because he shifts the light right back to us. So, yeah, even if you attempt to gaze on Christ, and of course, that's what we do in our spiritual journeys, there's a lot of talk about Jesus in the early part of the journey and who was he and what was he like. But you'll find that Christian mystics, as they mature, they talk less and less about Christ. Why? Because then the light of Christ is like a gaze looking through their eyes at the world. So the world is seen in a new light, and Christ isn't talked about as much by the more mature Christian mystics. Why? Because Christ is the light of the gaze shining right through them, enlightening the world.
And we're going to come to that in a minute when we talk about Thomas Keating, but we're still talking about Christ as light and warmth. And as we were preparing for this episode, I mentioned to you that, Christ as light is universal,
Yeah.
common. Most people would understand that. That's the common metaphor throughout the scriptures. But the warmth element is something that I think is there in the tradition, but something that you've given emphasis to that has stuck with me over the years since knowing you.
Yes. Well, I mentioned it earlier a bit in the experience of Eucharist or communion. As the wine goes down into your throat, you have this experience of warmth that it warms you within. And so it's present there right in uh, this kind of ritual that has been going on for ages. But I really like this in the hesychasts of the all the way from the third century all the way up to the present. Those are the desert monks of the Eastern Orthodox tradition. Hezekiah or Hezekiah means stillness, so they're the ones that practice stillness. So they use this metaphor of warmth not just as a conceptual kind of metaphor, but also as an actual physical experience. They say as you practice, there's the Jesus prayer. There's a particular prayer in Scripture they repeat over and over and over until they have this actual experience of the heart region of their body. You might say the heart chakra becoming warm. And then that warmth spreads out to the world and divinizes the entire world. For example, Theophanes the Recluse, who was a Russian hesychast from the 19th century, has this to say. He says, when attention descends into the heart, and this is something the hesychasts, the desert monks, said all the time. They said, make the mind descend into the heart. So there they would use the breath in order to enable the mind to go, the attention to go into the heart. He says, when attention descends into the heart, it attracts all the powers of the soul and body into one point there. This concentration of all human life in one place, the heart, is immediately reflected in the heart by a special sensation that is the beginning of warmth. This sensation, faint at the beginning, becomes gradually stronger, firmer, and deeper. At first, only tepid, it grows into a warm feeling and concentrates the attention upon itself. And so it comes about that this attention, by its own vigor, gives birth to warmth in the heart. And this warmth then holds the attention without any special effort. The flame once kindled burns by itself, and no one knows how it is fed. Here lies the mystery. The flame does not kindle immediately, but only after we put our part in a discipline of this prayer, and then it arises. This gives birth to this warmth in the heart, constantly increasing and burning ever more brightly during inner prayer. So this is an actual experience of visceral warmth, but in the tradition of kenosis, as he says, we don't know how it kindles because it's not like we see a fire that the warmth is coming from. Why? Well, in this metaphor, Christ is the fire, right? But the fire is emptied out into the experience of warmth. So there's warmth, but no fire because of the self emptying of Christ. So we experience in the warmth of the heart, that's often called prayer of the heart, and then we breathe, we exhale this warmth out of the heart into everything as we go about our day, so that it too is brought into our heart and is divinized in this kind of warmth. An incredibly beautiful image. I wanted to mention one more thing. Another visceral experience of this for me is, as a photographer, I like to follow the autumn leaves. And here in the west and southwest, especially the golden aspen leaves, and then later the cottonwoods. So there's one place in particular in Colorado near Kebler Pass where the second largest aspen grove in the world is present. So you can hike for a couple of hours through these golden leaves in October. And I find what happens is it's not just visual. It's not just that these leaves are golden, but the very air is golden. And then it transfers to my heart, to where I have this experience of Christ, which is the light of Jesus and the warmth of Mary Magdalene together as the experience of Christ within my heart. So it sort of jump starts this kind of prayer of the heart just by hiking through these aspens.
That is very beautiful. And it's powerful to take in these metaphors, both illuminating and heartwarming, pun intended. Now let's shift the gaze to the next metaphor. Here we're going to be looking at Christ as a listening presence, bringing us to birth.
Yes, to me, this is one of the most important of these metaphors and these experiences. I had this experience when I first met Thomas Keating. He had resigned as abbot of the Trappist monastery in St. Joseph, Massachusetts. And he was the guest master at St. Benedict's Monastery in Snowmass, Colorado. And he would, as I would speak to him, I was in my early 20s. I had all kinds of questions. He would just kind of listen and listen and listen. And sometimes, in fact, when I'd ask these passionate questions, he'd start humming. And I realized he was helping me get my attention off the burning questions so that I would look within and find this calmer, deeper kind of presence. So he didn't have lots of things to tell me. He was this kind of listening presence. And when I met Thomas, I realized, oh, this is what Christ is about, this kind of listening, this listening presence. And many people used to complain, oh, Thomas in his mode of spiritual direction, he doesn't say very much. And I realized, well, that was part of his charisma, is that he was this kind of listening presence. So then, as I would go out into nature and I would experience the silence of the natural world, it wasn't just a nothing. It wasn't just this lack of audible sound. I realized that in that silence of the natural world, I was listened to, and that new depths came to birth in my heart because I was listened to. And I realize, if you want to alter the philosopher Descartes' phrase, he says, I think, therefore I am. I realized, it's really, I am listened to, therefore I am. The other experience I had of this is when I was an undergraduate at Colorado State University. It was in a class on Eastern religions, actually. The professor, James Boyd, he would really listen to the students. He'd say, I'm working on a certain issue here in my study of Buddhism and later Hinduism and Christianity. I'm wondering what you have to say about this, that you could help me as I'm trying to discern what it is, that this new insight. And so we would give him our answers, and then he would hone our answers. He would listen to them, but then he would ask new questions like, yeah, but what did you ever see it in this way or that way? And then we would give him new answers. And it was this listening kind of presence, wanting to learn from us. And I found that was an incredibly effective mode of teaching, that here was this great professor wanting to learn from us and listening to what we had to say. It brought to birth in us as students this amazing kind of insight that we didn't even know was there. So again, I am listened to, therefore I am. And to me, this goes back to my Quaker heritage. George Fox in England, and he says to his fellow Quakers, he instructed them to travel about the land seeking to answer to that of Christ that they found in everyone. So this presupposes they first have to listen to those they encounter if they're ever going to answer to that of Christ in everyone. And this, of course, is a chief Quaker teaching that the inner light of Christ inhabits everyone. This is why the Quakers were such practitioners of social justice. They found the presence of Christ in other races, including Black people and indigenous people and Asian people. And so this was what motivated their efforts at social justice, as they found and listened to the presence of Christ there in a fresh way. And to me, this is one of the most powerful metaphors or aspects of Christ, because as we go throughout the day, we find that people desperately want to be heard. They want to be listened to. And Joanne, my wife, and I joke that oftentimes we find ourselves listening to other people and asking all about them, and they don't ask us any questions at all. We're like, well, why won't they ask us about our history? And she reminds me, well, this is just part of our calling, Stephen. We're meant to listen to others as they tell us their story, and they may forget to ask us anything, but it brings them to birth in a new way that they are listened to, therefore they are. So I find that as I spend time in the wilderness, and I do that a lot of times, I do it every day. In fact, every afternoon I go to a place where there's no cell phone service, just a couple miles from here, and I go into the silence. I feel listened to. New creativity comes to birth. And so then I go to the coffee shop, I go out into the society here in Taos, and I find myself listening to others. And the listening of Christ has, of course, its own quality to it. It is a warm and radiant, enlightening kind of listening that does not call any attention to itself. So, this experience of being listened to is so powerful. And so I'm wondering for you, Will, how have you experienced this sense of being listened to? Where do you get this kind of experience in your own life?
In many of the same ways as you do. And listening to you here, you sharing your experience with Thomas Keating. Well, my mind's going to St. Benedict's Snow Mass.
Ah,
I never had a chance to meet Thomas in person, but I've been to the monastery several times. So I'm just recalling that landscape. And I can just imagine turning left down Monastery Drive. And it's just like once you come into that valley, the mind goes quiet. And there's a deeper listening that just seems to be invoked by that place. And
yes,
that's perhaps been cultivated by the monks there who have cultivated that type of
yeah,
listening presence. You know, it saddens me that the monastery is closing, but in some sense, I do consider it a spiritual home. And throughout the week, I will bring it to mind in the spirit of remembrance just to get in touch with that deeper sense of listening.
yes,
And I think that's so much connected to not just the monastery and being in the walls and praying with the monks, but that landscape itself. I was mostly been there in the wintertime. So you have the quiet
yeah,
stillness of snow, and the days are shorter, so the dark nights. At some point, it does go beyond words, but in my experience, a fullness that comes from that silence and comes from that listening. And in all my experiences hiking in Colorado and here in the Northwest, I can relate to what you were saying a minute ago about how you spend the afternoons in nature and then go listen. I do find that it's outdoors in the quiet spaces that it's both kind of a deeper memory that comes alive, like I was saying, a deeper fullness or wholeness that comes alive, a remembrance, but then also the creative ideas come, for what could be in the future. That gives me hope and optimism. So there's
yes,
creativity that is sparked by coming into these quiet places and listening. So perhaps I'm going on, but The last point I'd like to add here too is that I've been the recipient of you listening me into being. Um, and from the very beginning, noticing that as distinct. One of the things you did was you met with each student in class and you took them out to coffee and you wanted to listen to their stories, get to know us. And, that was different than most teachers, but very, I think, sincere and genuine. And it is powerful to be listened to with such focus and kindness and warmth. And it makes me think this too. I've never met Thomas, but I perhaps have met him through you because you are continuing in his spirit of listening.
Yes, I found actually those coffee times. So I would invite students to come out, eat for to have at least one coffee time at a coffee shop near campus at Naropa. I found later that that was many of the students' favorite part of the course. And the interesting thing was the impetus for having coffee with a student was not to talk about the class. It was to talk about their own spiritual journey. And here's the other part of that listening. It wasn't just me going, "Oh, I'm going to listen to you. Isn't that wonderful?" No, the purpose of the listening is to learn from. So I learned so much from those students. And of course, at Naropa, students have already had a long spiritual journey before I ever met them. I learned so much. And so here's the part that's the most important in that listening is a learning. So I am listened to and learned from, therefore I am. So here's the thing, it's not just that, it's not one way. It's not just one person's listening and then the other is opening up. No, the listener is learning from and receiving. So the energy flow is able to keep going. And it turned out most students wanted to meet again. Some of them two, three, four times have that coffee time. And that too is a part of this listening, is when I realized that the divine presence, God, the great mystery, Christ, learns from us. And this is a part of process theology. Alfred Norton Whitehead, he talks about two aspects of the divine God. This is the part that's eternal, that is complete, that always was, that he calls that the primordial aspect of God. And then there's a second pole, which he calls the consequent goal, and that is God in us learning through our experience new things for the divine life to take into itself, that enliven and enrich it. In the metaphor we use here often, it's the echo of the divine unspoken word returning with new words. So it is the divine learning from me in the silence that is the most powerful. There are new depths that come to birth within me in being listened to in the silence of nature, not just being listened to, but being learned from. And I think that's also one of the empowering aspects of those coffee meetings, is that students realize they're being learned from. And nothing brings your inner soul, your inner spirit to birth like knowing that you're being learned from, that you are needed. And we live in a world where people desperately want that. They want to be learned from. And I feel it's, again, learning from others isn't just a nice gesture. I feel like a kid in a candy store. There's so much to learn. It's endless. To me, that's what eternity is. If I picture heaven, it's just another dimension where my boundaries are opened up even more, and I'm able to learn even more. So yes, this is perhaps one of the most powerful uh, metaphors of the Christian contemplative journey, is that of listening. Thomas Keating mentioned it all the time. He said essentially contemplation is listening. And Thomas Merton said, he said that when you go into the silence, he says that when you seek an answer, and so you go into the silence, he says the answer comes not when some sort of a word from God comes into the silence in order to sort of give you an answer to your question. He says, no, he says the answer comes when the silence itself bursts into flame and it becomes a word all on its own. So the silence itself is chock full of meaning. And one of those meanings is that I am listened to, therefore I am.
It really is powerful. And Thomas Keating and Thomas Merton, they're both Trappist monks who are part of the Benedictine tradition.
Yeah.
And the rule of Saint Benedict, which forms those traditions, begins with the word listen. Listen, my
Oh,
child. And I really do think that listening is the heart of the contemplative life, like you just mentioned, and perhaps the most transformative aspect, as we're talking about here.
I think it's
Um,
oh, I'm sorry.
well, yes, one of the most transformative aspects that really is needed in our world today. It's through listening that we'll be able to understand one another better and be able to get along better. It really is, I think, the start
Yes.
of any transformative process or any type of relationship building.
I've found in the context of world religions, this is one of the most transformative, unique aspects of Christian mystical spirituality is listening. I used to go to those Christian and Buddhist conferences at Naropa in the 1980s that Thomas would bring me to. And so you'd have a bunch of Christians from different traditions and a bunch of Buddhists. And so the Buddhists, where they were the spiritual masters up there, and they would have these great words of wisdom to share with everyone in the group, in the crowd. What did the Christians do? They would ask questions. They would ask constant questions and listen to what the Buddhists had to say. They didn't never acted like they had the teachings they were going to share with the world. They were just listening and fathoming new riches out of what these other Buddhists were saying. And I realized, the Christian path is one of listening, which is the exact opposite of what people see in garden variety Christianity, where you think that Christians are going around proselytizing, telling everyone else the way it is. That's actually the exact opposite. When you compare Christian mystical spirituality to that of other traditions, there's this incredible listening and learning from the other. As Thomas always said, listening is the hallmark of Christian spirituality. Brother David Steindl-Rast wrote a book called The Listening Heart very early on, I think in the 80s. So, yes, listening, as you mentioned, well, right there at the beginning in the Rule of St. Benedict, it is the heart of Christian spirituality. And I'm so proud of that aspect of the spirituality of Christianity. Even though I am intraspiritual, drawing from all sorts of traditions, it is that calm, radiant, warm listening that, it just resonates with my heart. And it's so much a part of who I am.
So it's through this listening, the listening of the Trappists to the Buddhists back during those dialogues and your own listening in your own study that we arrive at this next metaphor, which is only made possible because of our Buddhist friends. So, this last metaphor that we're going to look at is Christ as interbeing.
Yes, this is one of the most beautiful things about interreligious dialogue is that two different traditions, say in this case Buddhist and Christian, listen to each other, and each of those traditions is able to fathom new depths in the other tradition that's there all along, but perhaps got ignored. One of the things that I saw, so there's a beautiful dialogue between Buddhists and Christians about emptiness. And there's a whole book on this. The name is escaping me at this moment, but it is a book where Buddhists and Christians are a Japanese Zen philosopher and various Christians, atheists, and Jews are all talking about emptiness. And of course, that's a chief Buddhist idea. So, what emerges in the dialogue is the Christians enable the Buddhists to see that when they talk about emptiness, it isn't just empty, it's actually a pregnant kind of void, and that it is full of presence. Maybe not a person or a God, but is full of presence. And these Christians help the Buddhists realize that emptiness empties itself. So emptiness empties itself and becomes, guess what? Fullness. So this is something that, of course, is already in the Buddhist tradition, but perhaps got forgotten. So the other way around, the Buddhists help Christians see, oh, I know the name of the book, The Emptying God. So the Buddhists help Christians see that the presence of God empties itself. It doesn't reify into this sort of being that is static. No, it empties itself out into the world, fullness emptying out into all things. And so Thich Nhat Hanh has been one of the figures that has been a part of this dialogue. He, of course, was a Vietnamese Zen Buddhist monk, and he has a book called The Living Buddha, Living Christ, which for me was absolutely transformative. So he takes various Christian scriptures and he sees it with a Buddhist lens, and he sees amazing things in those scriptures that Christians have forgotten about. So, of course, he uses his Buddhist insight to ferret out the hidden dimensions of Christ that Christians often ignore. So, according to Thich Nhat Hanh, Mahayana Buddhists realize the truth of interbeing. This is part of what emptiness is in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition. It is this sense that as you look at any one thing, it horizontally connects to billions of other things. So it's empty of own being. That is, it has a relational identity. That is, that everything is connected to everything else. Everything interweaves. So, for example, the trees from which we get our air are part of the mountains, which in turn precipitate the rain and snow that form the rivers, and they flow through our blood. So we can't look at our own biological being without seeing all of these other aspects within ourselves. So he says, for example, he says, just as a flower is made only of non flower elements, so it's made of the soil and the rain and the wind and the carbon dioxide, he then applies this to Buddhists and Christians. So he says, Buddhism is made only of non Buddhist elements, including Christian ones, and Christianity is made of non Christian elements, including Buddhist ones. In fact, he says, Buddhism has no separate self. When you're truly a happy Christian, you are also a Buddhist, and vice versa. So there is a sense of interbeing even in the religious traditions together. As I just mentioned, Christians have needed Buddhists to be able to see, this God empties out. And Buddhists have needed Christians to see, emptiness isn't just a nothing, it is a pregnant void that then empties itself into the world. So each needs the other. So there's Christian elements in Christianity and non Buddhist elements in Buddhism. So here's what he does, he applies this to the reality of Jesus' sense of self. He says that no self is utterly unique, for it interpenetrates every other self, right? The Buddhist element is that there isn't any billiard ball self, right? Every self is permeable to every other self. In fact, there isn't any such thing as a separate self. So he says, okay, so Christians want to say that Jesus is completely unique. Well, he says, who is not unique? Socrates, Muhammad, the Buddha, you and I were all unique. That's not just unique to Jesus. And then, this is the mind blower, he takes that quote where Jesus in the Gospels says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the source but through me. So then he says, well, who is that I that is speaking through here? It's not the billiard ball I that thinks it's all alone, that's all by itself. He says that this isn't the usual I that we think of. He says it's the I of interbeing, it's the I of life itself. It includes all things. So when Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, he's able to read into that scripture. So if you imagine that you're there when Jesus says that, when Jesus says, I, suddenly your attention is drawn horizontally to everything around Jesus, to the other disciples, to the desert, to the Sea of Galilee, to the sky. And it's as though you're able to look through Jesus' eyes. And of course, Jesus was Palestinian Jew. He probably had brown eyes, just as he had brown skin. And I see in those depictions, those Anglo depictions of Jesus with blue eyes, are a metaphor That is, they're like the sky. So when you look at Jesus, you're seeing through his eyes into all of creation. That is the symbolic meaning of the blue eyes. It has nothing to do with how he actually was physically, because he almost certainly had brown eyes. But so when Jesus says, I, you look through those eyes and you see to everything that is. So Thich Nhat Hanh is having this awareness of actually being with Christ and realizing that when Jesus says, I am the way, you're looking through him and you're seeing the truth of interbeing. Obviously, this has scriptural precedent because Jesus says the seed has to die, and then he points to all of the seeds that come from that seed. So, beautiful image here. I am the way. You really have to be in the mindset and heart set that Jesus was in to understand what he was saying. And Jesus, of course, didn't have a billiard ball self, but his self extended through all things. In fact, he said, I have to die to this individual self that you see so that I can inhabit all things in a more real way for all. But even when he was alive, his self interpenetrated and permeated all things. So beautiful, really, we might say, is why there is this death and resurrection, so that he can appear as the stranger on the road to Emmaus. And as soon as they realize it's actually Jesus, poof, he's gone, so that he can be present as the gardener at the empty tomb. And Mary Magdalene thinks it's only a gardener. And then when the gardener says to her, Mary, she realizes it's really Jesus. It's now the risen Christ. So Thich Nhat Hanh has this amazing insight into interbeing, which he helps Christians see that even the identity of Jesus is this kind of interbeing, this web. It's the Buddhist insight into the net of Indra, where each of us is like a jewel tied into this cosmic web, and every jewel it reflects every other jewel. There's the mirror image again. So Jesus is one of those jewels, probably an especially polished jewel that is really able to reflect everything around him. You and I are also jewels, but maybe we got some dust on us. Maybe we have a little bit of smudge, so that the smudge needs to be wiped off so that we can be like the jewel that Jesus is and reflect all things. So, this truth of interbeing and this Buddhist helping Christians to see what is the deepest part of Christianity, I find is absolutely beautiful.
That it is. And I do too. And that is one of my favorite books as well, Living Buddha, Living Christ.
Yes.
And just to that, to emphasize that Thich Nhat Hanh was in dialogue with Christian monks, Thomas Merton, Brother David, and others.
Yeah.
So he wasn't just looking at this from his Buddhist perspective. He was doing so in the spirit of dialogue with people in this tradition as well.
Yeah. Listening.
Yes. So the last thing we want to mention here, as we're talking about Christ as interbeing, is this idea of deep incarnation. So can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah, this term actually comes from a Danish theologian, Niels Gregersen, but it's absolutely obvious. His point is that even though Christians traditionally tend to focus on the uniqueness of Jesus, they've forgotten that he's part and parcel of the earth on which he lived, moved, and had his being. I mean, after all, Jesus in his physical form was a creature of the earth. He has a body made up of atoms of carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and all the other elements that emerged billions of years earlier from the original supernovas that formed our solar system. And in fact, the atoms that made up his body once belonged to a multitude of other creatures. So, Jesus, even if you look at just Jesus, is part of a whole web of physical elements and non human creatures, all of which contributed their unique wisdom to his presence and personality and were sanctified, made holy in a fresh way in his life on earth. And in fact, you might even think, Jesus' body is composed of billions of microorganisms, just as in each of us. I mean, we all know if we have an illness and we have to take an antibiotic, what does the doctor say? Well, you need to eat some yogurt, you need to have some probiotics and restore those gut organisms that are needed for digestion and for everything else in your body. Same way with Jesus. He has all those microorganisms. He has a living ecosystem inside of his body. What about his personality? He was part of a Palestinian Jewish culture. He was part of a landscape, the Sea of Galilee. He was part of this kind of desert biome with periodic lakes and scrub trees up in the foothills where he would go to pray. These are all, they made up a part of who he was. He drank the water from the local areas there. He drank the wine that was made of the water of the local areas. So deep incarnation is simply looking more thoroughly at any of us, and in this case, Jesus, to see that even if you were just to look at Jesus, you would automatically have your attention expanded to include all of these other aspects. Now, we have this famous church here near Taos. It's called Santuario de Chimayo. So it is this church that was built in the 1700s, and it's called the Holy Dirt Church. So here's the interesting thing. There's a little hole, El Pochito, in the side room that has dirt within it that people come from miles around to rub this healing dirt on their bodies, whatever aspect of their body they feel needs a healing. And my wife and I have done pilgrimages there. Some people walk all the way from Albuquerque by car. That would be 2.5 hours. But walking would even be longer. We walk about 3 miles each way. On Good Friday, you make a pilgrimage to this church, and then there's crutches all over the wall. It's very interesting. I love it. In northern New Mexico here, there are all of these sort of magical kind of places, and the Sanctuario is one of those. And the most interesting part was waiting in line on one of those pilgrimages. So this guy comes in overalls and a dolly, and he's got two paint buckets full of dirt to replenish the dirt in that hole. So I just loved it because it's what it's showing is the dirt in that hole isn't just this special dirt that you have to go to the church to get. It's the dirt that's from those beautiful beigeish kind of badland hills right around it. And as one priest at that church said, he was asked about the holy dirt in that hole. And he said, well, all dirt is holy. So here you're focusing on, people have focused their attention on this holy dirt for years and years. And that's part of what's given it its sacred dimension, or I might say an added layer of sacredness, since all dirt is holy. But what it enables you to do is to find sacredness and healing powers in all of the dirt in the surrounding area where you live, just as in the Eucharist, the bread and the wine are able to be a mirror in which you can see the sacredness of matter all around. So I love that pilgrimage to Chimayo, to the holy dirt, which then enables me to go throughout my day. I like to walk in our backyard, which is made of essentially the same soil. I like to walk barefoot or in my moccasins. It's funny because our daughters want us to put a deck there. And I'm like, no, I want to feel that soft, friable dirt that we have here. It's interesting because when it rains here, the dirt poofs out and it's very soft. I've never seen anything like it. And so to realize that's holy dirt, and the church at Chamayo really illustrates that principle of deep incarnation. We might have our faith when we go on pilgrimage, they're localized into the dirt in this little well in the side room, but it is pointing us to the holiness of the dirt that is all around us.
And I think this idea really is a hallmark of wilderness Christian mysticism, that it's not all about belief, but it's about experience.
Yes, and physical experience, visceral experience.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. That's all we have for today. These four metaphors: Christ as mirror, Christ as light and warmth, Christ as listening presence, and Christ as inner being. And our hope is that this has been helpful in showing that Christ's true nature is all encompassing, all embracing, and unifying. And we hope this helps you to see Christ in you and to experience Christ on new levels.
I've especially enjoyed this episode. It is so rich and full, and this is there's such beauty here, and I'm so glad that we've been able to discuss this, Will, you and I together, and for a wider web of listeners who may take this and add their own insights to this in fresh ways that we never envisioned.
Well, thank you, Stephen. As always, this has been a delight, and I appreciate you taking the time to share with us your wisdom.
And thank you, Will. Thanks for all that you have added to this whole process.
All right. Till next time, take care.
Yes, goodbye.
Dear friends and listeners, we've come to the end of this episode of Nature as Beloved, Nature as Self. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know by liking, commenting, and sharing this episode with others. If you have a question you would like answered, are interested in learning more about a topic, or would like to pursue one-on-one spiritual direction with either of us, you can write to us at natureasbeloved@gmail.com. You can also find us on Instagram at natureasbeloved. For daily photos and quotes, you can follow Stephen on Facebook or Instagram at the Stephen Hatch Outlook. And for more information about Stephen's books, you can find them on Stephen K. Hatch's Amazon author page. Until next time, may you continue to walk in beauty, be well, and stay wild.